Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and with me is the perfect imitator of all kinds of pop cultural icons, Mackenzie.
Thank you, Patrick. It's originally here.
Nice. So, how are you today?
I'm good. No complaints, man. It was a snow day today for the school that I work at, so I was able to
Yep, fair enough.
avoid doing things. Got a lot of housework done. That was nice.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be covering something a bit different than literature. We're going to cover music this time, right? And specifically what we were thinking of doing is looking at how music evolved in Canada, became what it is, or at least what it was until the, say, 19th century, where we are in our relative chronology. And I actually want to focus also on one of the biggest musical sensations that Canada has ever produced, and certainly the most successful music sensation of her time, right? And obviously I'm talking about Céline Dion.
Of course, the best Canadian artist, our most sacred treasure.
And certainly from the 19th century.
We also have Michael Bublé.
That's true.
And Alex Trebek. But if you want to hear more about all these musical artists and Alex Trebek, the greatest game show host of all time, check out Pop Canada, our sister series that I run and do. It's better.
It is much better.
It's certainly more relaxed anyway.
Exactly. So what we're going to start off today, before actually talking about this superstar, who, in case nobody got the joke, is not Céline Dion. I just wanted to set the scene for how Canada went from kind of a musical backwater, or exactly what you'd expect from a colony, right? To basically producing one of the most successful music stars in the world at that time, right? Who was actually one of Queen Victoria's friends. So how do you go from going to I'll cut this out of the show. Whatever. So
How do you become Canadian music is the question today, folks. How did we come from where we were because we were this small colony, right? As we've said many times in the show, Canada's development was a bit different because we started as trading post first and foremost. And so that meant we didn't really have people congregating the same way. We didn't have music halls. We weren't big enough to warrant music halls.
Yep.
So how did we build any kind of musical identity where you can that gave birth to artists like Michael Bublé, Celine Dion, Justin Bieber, Arcade Fire?
Arcade Fire, yes.
Arcade Fire, and all these other big artists who are now have some critical acclaim. How did we go from very humble origins to giving Leonard Cohen?
I accidentally muted myself, but yes. So where to begin, I guess, is the question. Where would you begin in examining this kind of overview of Canadian music, right? I guess you can start with Indigenous cultures, right? We're going to go over some very general points in order to get to talk about our actual character today. But obviously, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that obviously Indigenous cultures had music and still do to this very day, right? That is important to note. Music in Canada is obviously not just a European thing, right?
Yes, and talking about musical influences, when you take a look at music history, me and Patrick were talking about this before, you often hear of the two main influences. There's European music, so classical predominantly, as the original genre, and then African music that came with them when slaves were brought over, that then became things like the blues, which developed into soul, rock and roll, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then the often unheard of or not very talked about third one we have in North America comes from First Nations music.
Absolutely.
And we'll talk about that a bit more as we progress.
Yeah. By the way, there's actually a wonderful documentary that I had to watch a few years ago for a class called Rumble, right? And it's all about exactly what you're talking about, how Indigenous populations in the US and Canada have kind of been pushed to the side in our acknowledgement of their influence on pop music, right?
Yeah.
It's really great. I'm sure listeners can find it, or I might try to link it in the description. It's fantastic. And it basically goes over some of the ones that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So it goes into blues and rock and jazz and just general folk music, and sees like, no, like indigenous populations and their styles have had an immense influence on how people sing, how people play instruments, what kind of instruments we play.
Well, also just take a look at the rise of psychedelia, the
Yes.
spiritual trip and spiritual journey. Where do people think spiritual journeys and trips came from?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like, sorry to burst your bubble, hippies, but you weren't the first to do that.
No, and it is kind of interesting because it does kind of represent like the hippie movement and what you see today with like corporate getaways in which people will practice mindfulness and stuff like that, in which you kind of see the adoption of certain indigenous elements, but not quite for the reasons that they were intended, right? There's a type of perversion of them in a sense. And you see similar things happening in music as well. Although I don't think necessarily in music it was necessarily malicious in its intent. It's just the way that cultures interact. But it is something interesting to bring up. So in terms of indigenous music, we often think of it in terms of, say, in terms of ghost dances or sun dances, like ceremonial acts, right? But obviously, indigenous cultures did have musical entertainment, right? And like I said, while we're not going to get into much detail today, what you saw as instruments were mostly centered around drums. And you actually, and I didn't know this, you actually saw forms of whistles sometimes in indigenous music, right? Which is something that I'd never heard of until just briefly researching it today, right? So you had whistles, drums, you had rattles, but what was most important for a lot of indigenous populations, especially those that would make first contact with Europeans in the 15th century, was the voice, right? And that's something that they bring up in Rumble as well, in that documentary I was mentioning, is the way that people were singing and using their voice is extremely influenced by indigenous populations, right? Which I find kind of cool and definitely highlights the more storytelling and story-driven elements of a lot of indigenous songs.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also something that you see in folk music, right? That you see at least heavily influenced in folk music from Canada, right? Or you see this in America as well, where the focus is on the story, right? The way that you sing doesn't have to be fantastic, but the point is to tell a story in a way that's lively and convey something that everyone can kind of get behind.
Right, and that's definitely, again, still influences coming from First Nation and African artists and music, but that's also like you have some that original European music coming into play, the original ballads with old school bards going from town to town and medieval Renaissance times sort of coming into play that way. Their own original folk music, but then it gets a really interesting blending when you put the three influences together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm kind of curious, like, when you imagine folk song in Canada, right, what do you think of? Because it was the dominant form of music in Canada, at least, until the middle of the 19th century about. So, like, what comes to your mind when you imagine folk songs, right?
I honestly,
instruments and stuff.
Yeah, it's very lively to me,
Mm-hmm.
Like the folk music that I remember hearing always seemed like lively, jaunty, something you don't hear at a pub.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Although at the time you would have
violins.
necessarily heard it at the pub, right?
No.
I mean, you could have.
Well, a lot of the time the trapping station was the pub.
Exactly. There was a pub everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere was a pub if you put your mind to it. My house is a pub if I put my mind to it.
Absolutely. So, but yeah, exactly. It's lively. It's what kind of musical topics, like what kind of subjects do folk songs usually talk about?
Again, storytelling, like you're saying, and the stories often revolve common man, hard work, labor, that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
Putting in the hard day's work.
Very universal themes. Like that's kind of what I imagine when I imagine folk song. You don't go into like much depth in terms of personal sentiment or stuff like that. You go into something that everyone can kind of get on board.
But that's because you want everybody to enjoy themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like folk is not like, I guess it's a kind of, it comes down to like low versus high art and whatever, like kind of bullshit argument you want to make about that.
Well, that's folk versus classical.
Exactly, is what I'm going for. Yeah.
It's even in the way folk is often performed. Folk is often a couple of artists at most. You have two or three, maybe, you know, you have your main singer, maybe somebody's on the violin or the fiddle, or they're on their, like, the guitar-esque instrument of the area.
Yep.
Maybe somebody has some kind of percussions, and then that's about it. Versus classical, you have these large sweeping bands, you know?
Absolutely. But it is kind of interesting. You mentioned this earlier when we just started recording, like classical music and opera or something like that, thing that you'd consider more high art, was very inaccessible in Canada. Not just in terms of like actual structures and finances, but even just original material from Canada. A lot of it, the very few that were produced in Canada, came from Europe, right? There was no, like, any kind of original production would have been folk and would have been very much limited to localized communities, friends and family gatherings, the local bar, the church, even a bit.
Well, because it doesn't speak to them. We talked about this in the we've talked about this a little bit before, the struggle between mother country and colony.
Right.
And the colony the mother country is predominantly made up of ruling class. That's the whole idea behind the mother country, because that's where they are. And if the ruling class of your colony is removed, you're left with the working man. And the working man, they're not going to like classical music. They're not going to understand it. It's not going to connect with them.
Yeah, so or they couldn't afford it even if they wanted to.
You know, there's no demand to create classical music. And there's also, that means there's nobody to keep it going to produce classical music. If there's nobody that shows an interest, and there's no way, because art is at its best when there's multiple artists in conversation with each other, which is why you had great folk music from Quebec, because you have a lot of folk artists, which means all the folk artists can sort of play off of each other, and they have rivalries, competitions, all that sort of stuff.
But you also get, like, outside of the fact that for the common person, they wouldn't have necessarily been able to afford or appreciate classical music, which is subject to debate. I think beautiful music can be appreciated by people of all classes in a sense. But
for sure. And I'm not saying, I don't want to make the argument that classic is just for it's more just, it might not have been music that they like. It's classical often doesn't talk about the same themes, you know?
And there's this, you're absolutely right. And there's this sense also, Canada for a long time was in a survival mode, and you don't really want to take the time to build opera houses when what you're thinking about is surviving the winter, or surviving raid from the French, or surviving
your taxes.
Yeah. Right.
In reality, though, like, building an opera takes a lot of manpower. And at the time, we were an industrial nation. That manpower needed to be in the farms. Therefore, you could only have one or two people roaming the countryside to be musicians.
Exactly. Right. So it's kind of interesting. So even, right, folk music, which I guess could be considered the most original type of music that Canada was producing for up until the 19th
most
century.
Original music in general.
Yeah, exactly. But even that, you can see, is very much copied and adapted from European styles, right? And so there was a really interesting example that I found looking into this episode. One of the best known folk songs from Canada is one called Farewell to Nova Scotia, right? And that's actually adapted from a 1791 Scottish song called The Soldier's Adieu, which is a classical piece, right? And so it's very interesting to me that a lot of the people who came here, or at least some of the people who came here, would have at least had an awareness of classical pieces, but used the instruments that are at their disposal, which, as you said, were very much string instruments that came from anywhere. You saw sometimes Finnish instruments come to Canada, or small mouth instruments like the Chinese Cheng was something that happened. Like, and use basically
a lack of metal instruments, for sure.
Right. So all of these basically forced people to create folk versions of The Soldier's Adieu. And I wanted to actually share my screen here and, like, kind of give a side by side of these two pieces, right? Because I think it's kind of interesting to note the type of similarities that you see. So this is the original.
Rock and roll.
This is the original piece called The Soldier's Adieu.
Adieu, adieu, my only life, my honor calls me from thee. Remember those tears, but he'll become.
So that was the Soldier's Edzir. This is Farewell to Nova Scotia.
Farewell to Nova Scotia, the sea-bound coast. Let your mountains dark and dreary be. When I am far away on the briny ocean tossed, will you ever heave a sigh or a wish for me?
I kind of see the similarity there.
I can see it.
Yeah.
But that's also like saying, it's like saying the four chords, you know, where all sort of music is based off of
Sure.
each other. It's like, yeah, that's true, but you still have to do it well.
Yeah, obviously. Right. But it is kind of cool that there is a kind of automatic form of democratization that happens when you come to the colonies of being like, yep, this is just something that everyone can sing. Right. Yeah. Anything else that you wanted to mention so far as to like folk music and kind of the place of operas and classical music or indigenous cultures, that kind of thing?
As we sort of mentioned earlier, still, I can't impress this enough, like how distinct our music can become just because of the different cultures that we have influenced on us.
Right.
And even when it comes to African music, we have this notion in Canada that it might not have been so influential because we didn't have slaves here. We did.
Yep. Absolutely.
We had similar situation, like maybe not as bad as the US, but again, we were a 3, they
Huge
were
air
a 1
quotes.
out of 10, you know?
Yep. Yep.
If we had to give it a grade out of 10, we were a 3, they were a 1. So still not good. So that means that it was still there. And I think try and listen to some Quebec music, the themes that they talk about. Well, not just Quebec, but all Canadian music. I say Quebec because Quebec seems to be where a lot of the artists came from.
Yep.
And you'll continuously see that. Well, we were talking before the show, the big one was Des Générations. Did I say it right?
By Mes Aïeux. Yep.
Yeah. You know, one of the most famous Quebec folk songs of all time. That pounding drum beat that starts it is very First Nations.
Yeah, it screams of that. Absolutely.
It screams of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to bring up. I was like, oh yeah, that's true. We can't forget to mention the drums, which provide the beat to almost anything. And obviously drums existed elsewhere, but the way that the drums were played is obviously very much influenced here, at least, by Indigenous people.
Yeah. The one thing I just as a band recommendation,
Sure.
Tribe Called Red, always great for listening to First Nation music.
Fantastic. Yep, absolutely. What's kind of interesting to note as well, and will kind of lead us eventually, or at least something that we should keep in mind when we think about our superstar that we're talking about, Emma Albani, is for a long time in Canada, it was very hard to make a living from music. It's still hard to make any living from music, obviously, but it really wasn't like a full-time job that many people had. At best, people were like jacks of all trade. They were multi-instrumentalists, they were band leaders, teachers, composers for special occasions like church ceremonies, etc. No one was ever like, I'm a full-time guitarist, right? That's just wasn't a thing.
Honestly, that's still the case with a lot of musicians. Unless you're a superstar, you're going to be doing a bit of everything.
Absolutely. But what you kind of start to see with the middle of the 19th century is industrialization. It finally reaches Canada.
Woo! Right? Capitalism! Full force ahead! Woo!
Right. So what comes with industrialization? You get print,
Capitalists.
but obviously capitalists, right? You get print, you get technologies, right? Which can bring metal instruments that you were mentioning. You even had here in Canada by the middle of the 19th century, a stabilization of government, right? Which seems like a really small thing when you're thinking about music, but it's extremely important insofar as people are obviously more interested in coming to a colony that has a stable set of rules and stable government. Right. Yeah, exactly. Who knew? I want to go to a revolutionary country that's just in perpetual turmoil, obviously.
Always.
Yeah. So all of these kind of mixed together. And what happened were two things. One, people started actually printing sheet music a lot more. So in literary magazines like the Literary Garland, would actually start to print music in their pages, right? Starting in the 1840s, which meant that people could play from home, right? Or at least could all have access to the similar type of songs. So you kind of see a standardization of the types of songs that are played, even in terms of folk. So you don't get as much experimentation that's going on, right? So in that sense, it's kind of less interesting, but it does allow for people to have a broader access or a greater access to at least some kind of music culture than they might have had before. Right? What you also see, however, is the ability to create these opera houses and these concert halls in which suddenly you get a bigger influx of musicians from Europe, from the United States, who can actually put on shows. Yes, obviously for the aristocrats mostly, but still, you still see a noted influx, right, of these types of things. It's also kind of interesting to note that around the 19th century, topics change. Right. So where we were mentioning, right, folk tends to be broad, universal themes. What do you start to see with a standardization and obviously with the rise of Canadian nationalism is more nationalistic tunes, right? And so a lot of the songs that we still recognize today in Canada were actually written around the middle of the 19th century. So we have The Maple Leaf Forever, which is composed in 1867 by Alexander Muir. And you have Quélix-la-Vallée, who in 1880 writes Chant National. I don't know if you've ever heard that name, Quélix-la-Vallée. If that's
sort of. Yeah. That's familiar.
It's the person who wrote, they're the person who wrote the national anthem. Chant National is Canada's national anthem.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Right. It wasn't officially Canada's national anthem at that point, and when Quélix-la-Vallée was writing Chant National, they meant Quebec nation, right? He was French Canadian, so the Chant National is the French Canadian nation. So, which is kind of funny to think about how it became Canada's national anthem. But it's around this time that you see these types of songs emerge, right?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, same. It's kind of interesting to see, like, if I were asked to talk about music influences, honestly, like, this is not what would have come to mind. Like, print democratization or stabilization of government is not necessarily what would have immediately come to my mind. Technology, perhaps, but it is interesting to think about the material conditions that kind of give rise to different types of music. Anything that you wanted to add about that so far? Or?
No, I don't know. It just sort of, again, like, this is how music works. It goes around the time period.
Yeah.
A lot of music is going to stop when you start getting nationalism into it. Like most things, most progress, culture, and arts are going to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you were saying, so people start to come in more to Canada and stuff like that. And as steamships and railway travel progressed, foreign opera companies travel to Canada on a more regular basis. And here's where we'll kind of segue into our superstar for the day. So starting with English singer John Braham, who is quite the popular singer at the time. So he appears in Canada in 1841. And then you have people like violinist Ole Bull, I think you pronounce it. Another singer named Jerry Lind, a pianist, Sigismund Thalberg. So people from really all over Europe arrive. And before Confederation, like by, say, the 1860s, what happens is that all these famous people kind of set the norm, right, or set a standard for resident artists to strive for. Right. So whereas before all you had was folk or maybe a few people, now you could actually point to, as you said, like standards from literally the mother country in this case and say, this is what we're aiming for. Right. Which is kind of funny considering that you're like, oh, okay, you'd want to create your own culture, but just based entirely on European culture in this case, but whatever.
That's a culture, I guess. Sort of. Not really.
Kind of.
Does Canada have culture?
Does anyone have culture?
What even is culture? It's an iceberg. There
you go. So, is there anything else you wanted to add before we get to our character for today?
I don't think so. I think it'd be really interesting to look at modern Canadian music to see what's changed and what stayed the same. Because of course we have to talk about the American influence.
Of course.
And how it's sort of drafted onto us.
Yep.
So how do I say this? Because take a look at what happened to us. Because we have as usual, we have big Canadian talent. It just gets exported.
Yeah. Celine Dion.
Like
we make jokes and all,
shows.
Yeah, exactly.
So I find it interesting if you could sort of track, like, what stayed the same. Is there anything still remaining that's unique?
Right. it's a bit hard, obviously, to
Of
say
course.
that, just because
Mhm.
obviously we don't have recordings of a lot of these things, and the recording industry itself is a very, you were mentioning capitalist before, but it's very much based around, no, but it is based around the fact of selling something, right? And that's
Mhm.
why songs today are like 3 or 4 minutes long, is because it had to fit in a record, right? It's not
Had to fit
because
a soundbite.
exactly, right? Which didn't used to be the case. Songs used to be much longer, right? If you look at sheet music, right?
Well, it's also in the, like it was so long they had to break it up into movements.
Or even folk songs were longer, like in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah.
Again, and this is evidenced from the sheet music that we see in 19th century magazines, like we were mentioning. So again, there is inevitably this shift that happens, but it would be interesting. And we have recordings of the artist that we're talking about today, which I'll play. And so you'll be able to kind of see if there is anything that stays today. Right?
Mhm.
Although, to be fair, she is singing in a very old style. She's an opera singer. So perhaps maybe not much has changed because it is a
Not
very
much has-
conservative. Right.
The more that things the more the things change, the more they stay the same, right?
There you go.
I got there.
Hey, there you go. So have you ever heard of, so today we're going to be talking about Emma Albani, as she was known in her stage name.
Never heard of her. Tell me what's up.
So she was actually born Marie-Louise Cécile Emma La Jeunesse. And she's actually born in 1847, although I've seen sources claim 1852, whatever, in Chambly, which is about 20 minutes away from Montreal and is my hometown.
Oh,
Yeah.
the more you know.
There you go. The more you know. So she was born there. And she would be, as we mentioned at the start of the show, she would basically become Canada's first international celebrity. Whereas usually we would import music, now we're the ones who are exporting them, right? And what's kind of interesting is that despite her very noted success, as we'll talk about, it's interesting that today she's pretty much fallen into obscurity. I think pretty much music aficionados or historians would be aware of her, but the common person does not necessarily think of Emma Albani or Emma La Jeunesse as being, you know, up there in terms of popular Canadian artists.
Right.
She's not on Spotify, so you know. I think she only has like 4 or 5 recordings ever, because obviously at the time it was a very new medium.
Mhm.
So just a bit on her life, right? So Emma's father, Joseph, was actually a professional musician, and he taught her and Emma's sister, whose name is Calliope, I think, if I remember correctly.
Good name.
And he was the one who actually taught her the harp and piano at an early age, both her and her sister. Apparently, he was quite adamant about them adopting good practices. And Emma would practice about 4 hours a day, which is nuts, right? When you think about it. Especially, I think she started, if I remember correctly, I didn't write it down, but like at the age of 4 or 5. So like as a 4-year-old, imagine now anything grabbing your attention for 4 hours. But when you're 4, like,
Yeah. Oh, she had
fucking
100% got forced into that. You got come on.
oh yeah, there's no way that it's anything that is free will at this point. But I don't think the way that she spoke in interviews and stuff like that you can still find sometimes today in newspapers, like, she doesn't seem to resent it. She very much enjoyed music and appreciated it.
Mhm.
She didn't make a career out of it because she was forced into it. She wanted to play music, and her father taught her good practices to do so, right? And according to her, and I'm quoting, by the age of 8, I played Beethoven's sonatas and the principal works of Mozart, Haydn, and Handel. I could read them with ease, and every other description of pianoforte music came to me without the least difficulty. Which, that's a flex. Like, when you can play Mozart and Haydn at 8, what?
Ah,
See, kids, that's what 4 hours of practice a day does to you.
dedicate yourself for once, you lazy shits.
Are you talking
God.
to yourself there or the audience?
Myself.
Right. So, and it was actually pretty easy for Joseph to do this because Emma's mother had died after Emma's mother had died in childbirth. Joseph actually had become a music teacher at a convent in Montreal. So not only did he know how to actually, teach music, But Emma also received a good education free of charge at this convent because her father worked there.
Mhm.
So she was actually a well-educated lady and musically talented, right? which is pretty exceptional for the time, right? Or at least it's exceptional for a girl from Quebec at the time, I should say. What?
It's just funny. It's exceptional for a girl from Quebec.
At the time, yeah. Like, again, it's a poor colony. Like, what are you saying?
I know. It's just funny.
Where's the lie?
Phrasing.
And she, La Jeunesse, actually is quite lucky in many ways because she encountered a mother superior at the convent who actually encouraged her to pursue a career in music, which again would have been very, or at least rather uncommon at the time, right? But so clearly there was something that she was doing right. She wasn't just good. If the mother superior didn't ask her to be a housewife or to be a nun or a nurse or whatever, like, and actually encourage you to be a music sensation, like there's something to you, right? Unfortunately, the family didn't have much money to pay for formal training outside of where Joseph was teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, she still practiced, and she actually managed to start giving some shows in and around Montreal to the point where by 1860, so she would have been age 13 at this time, the Prince of Wales, so the future Edward VII, when he came to inaugurate the Victoria Bridge in Montreal, Emma was actually one of the soloists who was there with the Montreal Oratorio Society at the ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
So singing for royalty at the age of 13 is something that very few people have the chance to do in Canada. And so that's something that's definitely interesting to note here. But as is perhaps to be expected, all good dreams in Canada must come to an end in the 19th century. And having kind of reached the peak of her ability to grow as a musician, the family would move to New York, right? And thus, the exportation of this Canadian sensation would begin. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently,
export talent. Woo! let's not do anything to keep talent in Canada and grow the industry.
But and again, this kind of comes back to my point of it's surprising that the Mother Superior would encourage her, because part of the reason why they moved to New York is because citizens were more supportive of the idea of a woman on stage than
that's
perhaps,
how you had talent.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And also just like people in most women in French Canada were not encouraged to pursue these types of careers. And so you go to the US, right? And apparently Albany, New York was the LA of its time, it seems, right? And basically once there, Emma actually gives benefit concerts, right? And raises money, it raises enough money to send her and her family to Europe in order to continue her studies.
Right.
And basically it's like, this is almost like it's almost too simple of a story, because it's just one success after the other for her. There are a few times when it's a bit, when there's some mishaps with her shows, but by and large, like she just nails it until the end of her career. Right?
That's the sign of a good talent or musician,
Mm-hmm.
The voice, especially if you can keep your voice through old age, and if you can keep it as smooth as honey the whole way through. Yep. That is true dedication. That's true effort. That's beyond talent. That's you taking the time to care about what you're doing.
Absolutely.
That's passion,
Yeah. So later I'll show you, I'll have you listen to a clip of her singing, right? But this was the clip that I have, she would have been almost 60 at that time. And it's still a beautiful voice. So imagine when she was younger at this stage, when she's actually training, right? So these are names that I don't recognize, but apparently they were quite prominent in the music scene as teachers and masters at the time. But she studies under Gilbert Louis Dupré in Paris, and then goes to Milan to study under Francesco Lamperti. Right. Yes. No, just because Kemi was looking at me with these wide eyes as if like she knew who Francesco Lamperti was. Do you really? Oh, that's cool. Who is he?
Who should be doing the episode?
Oh, cool. Right. Oh, that's awesome. Okay. Wow. Yeah. Okay. I'm not cutting any of this out of the episode, but we don't hear you. It's fine. But so basically, she would train under these two, first with Dupré and then with Lamperti. And she would still take singing engagements to basically pay her bills.
Mm-hmm.
And Lamperti would grill her, right? And famously have her practice even more hours a day, right? I think in one of the sources that I saw, it got up to 7 hours a day, which is even more insane to think about, just because that must be torture on someone's voice, right? But hey, again, it seems to have worked because she faced a wonderful career, right? And what's interesting is that he would force her to learn what were considered at the time famously difficult operas, right? And one in particular called La Sonnambula, which I think just translates to the sleepwalker, if it's anything close to French. And basically, this teacher said that if she could learn this song, anything could be sung, right? You've kind of nailed it. So after years of training, so at this point, it would have been about 5 years of training under these two, she would actually make her grand debut, right, on stage in Messina, Italy in 1870, right, at the age of 22. And this is where she first adopts the name Emma Albani. Right. Now, there's some debate as to where that name comes from. Some saying that it's in honor of Albany, New York, where she obviously got her first, where she emerged as a singer, right? Whereas others say it was chosen by Lamperti, who wanted her name to sound more Italian and thus please the Italian audience. Which, okay, I guess like the erasure of your French Canadian heritage and name is worth the fame.
But I mean, I can't really blame her for that, though, because everybody does that. Everybody changes their name when they become like artists, you know?
Mm-hmm.
J.K. Rowling changed her name.
Yep.
As much as I don't like the woman, I can't blame her for doing that.
Yeah. And like a lot of, especially as you're saying, like a lot of women writers do that because it sells better.
Yeah.
Right.
But you're most likely see it in women entertainers and foreigners.
Yep.
Like we talk about in the Pop Canada episode with Alex Trebek, his full name is like George Alexander Trebekicek.
Right.
Because his family comes from the Ukraine, or his dad came from the Ukraine, and he eventually changed it because his dad's first name was George, and Trebekicek was a little weird, like hard for people to pronounce. Not weird, but it was hard for people to pronounce, so it became Alex Trebek.
Right, exactly. So, and especially at this time, so 1870, Italy is about to merge as a single unified country in 1871. So there is a rise.
Woo, Italy!
So there is this kind of rise in
past city states.
Like 500 years too late, but okay.
Imagine if Italy had been a unified state the whole time, how powerful they would be.
Imagine. They would have almost become a world empire sooner.
If Rome hadn't broken apart. If they kept the band together.
Do it for the children, Italy. But
Italy, we are the world, 2022.
So, and especially right at this time when Italy is about to merge, and so there's a rise in national sentiment. That again also makes sense, right? To pretend that at least you have some kind of Italian heritage, I guess. Funny enough, the name change to Albany would lead to some confusion later in her career when in 1894, another famous singer known as Madame Albani, Alboni instead of Ani. So this other famous singer died. And so many in French Canada mourned the wrong singer on that day, saying, oh my God, our own French Canadian prodigy died. But no, that's not what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Funny moment here. Funny enough, I was actually I fell into the same trap because I was researching Emma la Jeunesse Albani for a historical society in Chambly one time, and I found that very same article, right? That said like, oh my God, she's dead. And I'm like, what? She died in like 1930. Why is this newspaper from 1894 saying that she died? So I was just as confused.
I love those moments of confusion, man. That shit's the funniest part of history.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how like any actual timeline in history is stupid and not worth anything.
Like linear time is a lie. But it's also
like a small tangent, folks, but if anybody tries to like show you a timeline, it's kind of worthless unless it's happened in the past 100 years or so when we've had proper recording mechanisms in place.
It's not necessarily that it's worthless, but it at least at least be aware that it's a selection process.
If somebody shows you a timeline and says there is no inconsistency, they're a fucking liar.
Yes, that was perhaps like a better way of saying it.
Thanks. I need to throw in a swear word. That's my strength.
No, it's fine. But yeah, we're not a family-friendly show, I would say.
No.
But it is kind of interesting, especially like the methods. It does obviously come back to the methods of communication at the time, where it was just like, it's a complete mistake, but everyone just kind of ran with it because by the time information actually reaches someone, it's almost too late to change anything. So for a few weeks, at least, people in French Canada were confused. Mm-hmm. So, after her success in the show in Messina, right, she would actually be contracted by a certain Frédéric Guy at the prestigious Covent Garden Opera in London, right? And she would actually be the principal artist there from 1872 to 1896. Now, she basically had a secure career at this point. She was the headline for this opera house in London. And by the way, if people look up Emma Albani, she does travel. She does travel around the world, but she's still the headliner of that opera. And it does go through many names. So I want to list them all here, but it's possible that you see it under different names. But her mainstay was in London. Right. And funny enough, her first show at the Covent Garden Opera in London was none other than La Sonnambula, the opera that her teacher kept trying to have her learn, right? And clearly it worked because pieces like the Musical Times or newspapers like the Musical Times gave her absolutely rave reviews, right? And I want to quote here, "The great event of the month has been the success of Mademoiselle Albani, who made her debut as Amina in La Sonnambula, with a genuine soprano voice, a facile and unexaggerated execution, and a remarkable power of sostenuto in the higher part of her register. This young vocalist at once secured the good opinion of her audience and gradually advanced her position throughout the opera until the final." And then Anon Guinje? The final Anon Guige. I don't know what that is. It's a Latin term. Her brilliant rendering of which produced a storm of applause, which could only be appeased by her appearing 3 times before the curtain. So quite the review there. And this came out in May of 1872. So again, her premiere. So in 1830, she would marry Ernest Guy, who's the son of her manager.
When she was 30 or in 1830?
When she was 30.
Okay, there we go.
Sorry, did I say in 1830?
She was born in 1847.
Before she was even born.
She was married. Sounds about right, not gonna lie.
20 years before she was born, she was promised to marry someone.
Sounds about right.
That's a goddamn record. So, actually, what I was going to say is, right, as I mentioned, throughout this time, though, while she was headlining for 20 years in London, Albany would also perform throughout Europe, Russia, North America, Mexico, South Africa, basically all the British colonies, right? She would go to Ceylon, India, whatever, right? I see your grin. What's so funny?
I just love the idea of like, just left at the joke of born in 1830 or married in 1830. That's a timeline inconsistency
right there. Yep. See, history is meaningless.
No, but I married at 30. That's honestly kind of old almost, you know,
right.
Time.
I was wondering if we were going to talk about this, but like, yeah, it's kind of surprising.
I guess it's reflective of her traveling lifestyle. Like, because if she got married, you know, she's a woman, therefore she has to settle down.
But that's the thing, right? Is that it kind of goes against a lot of the ideas that we have about, or like the conventional ideas that we have about women at the time, right? Obviously, I don't think this would apply to most women in French Canadian women of this period. It barely applies for a lot of women until the 20th century, but like, or 21st, but it's kind of interesting that, you know, all evidence to the contrary, I've seen very little evidence of people pushing back against any type of career as a musician that she has or marrying older. Like, it's kind of surprising to me. I wonder why. Like, I guess it's because of her success, but I don't know. I don't know if you have anything about that to say.
About why she was different, her success, or?
Yeah, like, why do you think she would be an exception, I guess, to this, to the conventional women of the time? broadly speaking.
Her upbringing, her background, like she was already, because she moved, she was already an immigrant into a country, and that already makes her unconventional. It already makes it harder for her to be in the norm. So you at that point you have to make a choice. You either double down into the norm, or you decide to say, you know what, I'm already standing out. Let's go the whole 10 yards, and you fight that way.
Right. But it's kind of interesting that it can only go so far, and she still obviously marries and stuff like that. And apparently, it's quite a happy marriage. I haven't seen evidence to the contrary. And she does eventually have, I think, a child. I don't think she has more than one, which again, kind of exceptional. So because her career spans about 30 years, I just want to give a few highlights here, right? Because we've already been recording for about an hour now. And so I just want to kind of go over some of the major points, I think.
Do it.
So in the 1870s, Albani would go on a tour, or at least do a series of shows in Russia, or the Russian Empire at the time, namely in Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? Where she would actually sing in the Alexander Theater in the presence of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, right? Who would actually become quite impressed with her, right? In January of 1874, right, so not long after her time in Russia, Albani sang at the wedding of Queen Victoria's second son and Tsar Alexander's only daughter in St. Petersburg, right? So she basically in that moment catches the attention of Queen Victoria, right? Who, after her performance at this wedding, actually invites her to Windsor Castle for a private recital. And thus actually becomes a long and quite genuine friendship between the two, right? They would actually visit each other regularly until Victoria's death in 1901, right? The monarch would enjoy private concerts and private meetings with Emma, right? And she actually showered her in many gifts, which obviously the singer cherished, right? She had, I think, a pearl cross and necklace that was given to her, right, by the Queen, which I will share my screen here and I'll post it in the show notes. I have a picture of Albani with this pearl necklace on, right, which I'll show you right here.
Ooh.
Yeah, so this thing was offered to her by Queen Victoria. So this is Albani in 1892, so towards the end of her career.
Queen.
Absolutely.
Victoria looked at her and said, "Yes, Queen, slay."
You laugh, but Queen Victoria would actually mention her in her private diaries as being an exceptional woman. And like a lot of the information that we have about her and her personal life and her demeanor comes from Victoria's interactions with her.
So that's also a strong way of how we see her becoming still able to hold her identity as well.
Yeah.
You know, if you become friends with Queen Victoria, you can do whatever the fuck you want at that point. I'm sorry, but like...
I mean, fair enough.
Like, what are you going to do? It's like, oh, you don't agree with me? You want me to be a good, meek little housewife?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Hey, Vicky, I need some help over here. And Vicky's like, yeah, I got your back, babe.
It's also... like, especially it's kind of interesting because Queen Victoria, while representing obviously in the very rigid Victorian era that's named after her, but herself in her private life was apparently quite, had actually some progressive ideas about family and the way that women should be with their husbands, right? So I wouldn't be surprised actually that some of that either shone through with Emma la Jeunesse in their conversations or influenced her or was a point of unison between the two. But yeah, absolutely. Once you have the Queen's back, or once the Queen has your back, I think you're safe to do pretty much whatever. So she would actually cherish, right, this pearl cross and necklace, which she would wear often. And Queen Victoria actually left written instructions for Emma la Jeunesse to sing at her funeral, right? So Queen Vicky died in 1901, and it was expressly stated that Emma Albani sing at that moment, right? Which has to be a career highlight. Like, I know like the peak of her popularity was a bit past at that point, but still, like, you have to say that, like, holy shit. Like, you succeeded when you sing for the Queen.
You sing for the Queen. She sings for Emperor William. She like The girl got around.
Yeah, absolutely. So that exactly. So towards the end of her career in 1887, she sang Lohengrin in German, no less, right? At the Royal Opera in Berlin. And as you mentioned, Mac, right, Emperor William I was there. And the presence was the performance was so successful that he called her to his box and conferred upon her what I think is an honorary title. I don't think she ever anything ever panned out from that, but he offered her the title of Hofkammersängerin, which translates roughly to court singer. Right? And listeners might be thinking like, she sang in German? Yes. She was actually multilingual, perfectly so. She spoke French, English, Italian, German, and because of her ability to do so and her genuine talent, she would actually become one of the most cherished Wagnerian singers of that time. So whenever Wagner was put on, people wanted her to be in the lead, right? Which is awesome. Say what you will about Wagner and his legacy, but that's cool, right? So yeah, what's interesting also is that she exists right around this moment where opera is changing, right? So you were wondering like what her legacy was and all that, but it's kind of interesting.
What is a legacy?
Exactly. What's kind of interesting is that she was able to adapt to the changing styles and mentalities around opera at the time, because a lot of operas before the 19th century were sang in Italian. That was the lingua franca of opera, right? So, and suddenly as
the lingua franca,
as like nation states emerged as we understand them today, there was a rise in the need, or at least the desire, for operas and music in the vernacular, right, of the country. And speaking 4 languages, that really puts her on the map, right? So that's something that should be noted. And so it definitely helps with the propagation and continued success of her career, right? Where a lot of opera singers would not have necessarily been able to learn a new language at the end, or at least while they're adults, right? Certainly not enough to sing an opera in them. So just to kind of bring it back to Canada, right, for a minute, just because she is Canadian and this is a show about Canada.
Fine.
So in 1883, right, she would actually return to Canada after having left nearly 20 years ago and never returned. So this is the first time that she comes back to the country. And you might think, well, people were kind of angry with her for not necessarily giving them attention or anything like that. But no, right? If anything, they were very pleased to see that such an international sensation as Albani came back, right? And it's estimated that about 10,000 people greeted her in Montreal as she arrived. Which, damn, like you barely see that today. Like, I don't know what kind of, I guess a visit from the monarch would maybe elicit that, but even then, I don't know if 10,000 people is something that you would ever see again, swarming the streets of Montreal in order to see someone arrive.
I don't know. I feel like you could still get that. You can get that, but for all the wrong reasons. It would not be
Possibly.
in a positive way.
Possibly. Okay. Yes, that's true. I
mean,
mean,
we had lots of protests here.
That's true.
Tens of thousands of people swarming the streets, just not for any good reason.
Right. Exactly. But I mean, like in this case, yes. So yeah, it's kind of cool. Like, by the way, speaking of protests, complete tangent. Did you see the ones in Montreal the other day?
No.
Yeah, they came literally in our neighborhood.
What for?
The anti-vaxxers that are in Ottawa, the trucker supporters. They were in our neighborhood here. Yeah. Yeah. There were a lot of people also. I think there was even an anti-protest that started. So in this time, right, there's in 1883 when she comes, the famous poet at the time, who is kind of the national bard, if you will, of French Canada by this point, known as Louis Fréchette, would actually write a poem in honor of her arrival, right? Which I'll read a part of in French, but I'll link to it in the show notes. It's a really long poem. I won't say it all, right? So he basically compares her to a golden butterfly. He says, comme un papillon d'or qui dans son vol splendide méprise désormais la pauvre chrysalide, qui donc nous avait dit, prolifération, qu'entraînée au courant de tant d'ovations, Aux oublis généreux, femme inaccoutumée, tu rêvais, au moment même de la renommée, du succès de ton front fixé l'astre éclatant, à punir ton pays de ta froideur d'antan. So he starts off is actually saying like, you know, you're like a golden butterfly, you emerged from Canada and you had great success, but you also like left very quickly and you kind of shunned us, but it's worth it. He goes on to say basically at the end, it's like, it's nice that you've turned around. Right.
To be fair, what artist doesn't leave Canada?
Exactly, right? It's kind of cool.
Like if you want to grow your business or your image or whatever, you kind of have to.
Exactly. And this is going to be very funny when we see what one of her last words are, right? I'll kind of save that for the next time, for the end, but yeah. So basically, after 1883, she would return to Canada 9 times for tours across the country, right? Canada was expanding at this time. And by 1906, she had come back to Canada 9 times, even though she was permanently living in England. Right? So throughout her career, right, obviously, as you mentioned, she faced a lot of praise. She would composers would actually write pieces specifically for her. Gounod, von Flotow, Dvorak, and Sir Arthur Sullivan all wrote pieces for her that were actually quite successful. And apparently in 1893, so again towards the end of her career, she would actually move none other than Brahms to tears when he heard her rendition of the solo from his work Deutsches Requiem. Right? So even towards the end of her career, she was still nailing it. Right? So, and this is kind of where actually in 1893, in the 1890s, like the end is kind of the peak as well, right? So many historians kind of consider her kind of great moment came in 1890 when she gave a concert at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, right? Mm-hmm. And so doing, she would actually become the first French Canadian woman to perform in that theater, right? And she sang she sang the role of Desdemona in a version of Othello, an Italian version of Othello, known as Otello or Otello, I'm not sure.
Otello. Otello. What a wonderful.
Right. The year later, she would actually become the first person to sing that role at the Royal Italian Opera. Right. So I guess that's kind of why people consider this to be the peak of her career. Not only do you reach the Metropolitan Opera, which is still considered one of the greatest achievements of a musician's career, right? But she would become a first in many ways. And this is at this moment, I think, where we can kind of play, or at least I'll share you a recording of her voice, right? So this would have been around this time what her voice sounded like. The recording's a bit shit because it's early recording. There's a lot of static, but it's still indicative. So I found that beautiful.
Very nice, honestly.
Yeah. And I can definitely understand what the reviewers meant that we were saying, like reaching a high tone and actually being able to sustain it. Fantastic stuff. Right. So this was her at the peak of her career. But by 1896, she would actually make her farewell appearance, right? She would continue to be around, as we'll see, but as a headliner, that would be her last one, right? In part because changing tastes in theater obliged her to demonstrate a bit more flexibility in the styles of music that she would be able to sing, and a degree of diversity that perhaps she couldn't necessarily keep up with, especially where she was at in her career. She would have been 50 at this point. It's a bit harder to learn a new style completely. So despite kind of retiring at this point, she would still sing in recitals, private and otherwise, but financial troubles would actually force her to teach singing lessons, right?
Yeah.
So obviously there's no such thing
So
as
it goes.
there's no such thing as like a government pension necessarily at this time, right? Or at least as we understand it today. And part of that is because of the war, right? The First World War would have arrived towards the end of her life, right? And part of this was also because of bad investments, right? And so this is kind of interesting. It shows how much of a popular appeal she had, despite, as you were mentioning, her use of a very highbrow type of art, right? People actually tried to petition governments to help support her, right, financially. And some of them actually did. In 1920, the British government voted to give her an annual pension of £100 a year, right, to help with some relief, which I don't know what that is in modern money. Hold on. No. Anyway, doesn't matter. I'm just curious to look it up here. Let's see. Yeah, whatever. I can't find it. So it's still like in 1920, so like 100 years ago, still a couple $100 at the very least, right? Which is something. It helps, especially with how far a dollar could go or a pound could go at that time. In 1925, so a few years later, an initiative of the Australian singer Nellie Melba, on the initiative of that singer, a great benefit concert would actually help support her.
Mm-hmm.
And when reports of her financial troubles reached Montreal, the still existing journal La Presse sponsored a recital in 1925, that same year, at the Théâtre Saint-Denis, which obviously still exists. And they raised more than $4,000 for the singer, right?
Damn.
Right. So like people genuinely like...
But this is $4,000 at that time. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly.
Hot damn.
Right. So finally, the Canadian and Quebec governments were urged to come to her assistance with a kind of pension, but they declined to contribute on the grounds that at this point, she was a bit more of a British subject than a Canadian citizen.
Oh, fuck off.
She had lived in London since 1872.
Fuck off.
And
That's so dumb pedantic.
Yep, it absolutely is.
This is why you can't keep nice people, Canada. They keep running away to better opportunities. This is why we can't have nice things.
Right.
Except for, special effects and video game industry here in Montreal.
And like nice scenery and stuff like that.
But we can't keep that either because we're building fucking pipelines all the time.
Go off, King.
God damn it, Canada.
So her husband would actually die in 1925 in that same year. And she died 5 years later on April 3rd, 1930, right, at her home in Kensington. She would actually be honored many times throughout her life. And I think the most important one, at least for us here, is that she was actually made a Dame Commander of the British Empire, right, under King George V. So she was a lady, or she was a dame, rather, right? In 1925, when everyone was coming to her aid, she would have been Dame Emma La Jeunesse. So cool. Like, that's kind of like really awesome. And right. So before her death, and this is kind of where I think we'll keep it, we'll kind of finish our recap of her life and ask her, I'm curious about your thoughts here. She would state, I've married an Englishman and I've made England my home, but I still remain at heart a French Canadian.
Okay.
Interesting.
What's the issue? What's there to talk about that? It's a pretty, I don't know if but it's a pretty simple statement. She still remains a French Canadian at heart. My mother would say the same thing, and she hasn't lived in Canada for the past 23 years, 22 years. Right. But I'm kind of interested to see like how you would see that play out. Like if she barely came to Canada or at all and things like that, like how do you think in her music there's anything from the little bit that you've heard? It's all pretty similar, like that. Yeah, but it's also, I don't know, like it's where she was raised. That's true. Your childhood years are the most formative, so that's probably the very place where you imprint the most. Right. Absolutely. And I'm sure like it probably goes to her father as well. Her father probably bred strong Canadian or French Canadian values into her. Mm-hmm. My parents did the same. Yeah. No matter where I lived, that's just speaking as somebody who has lived in different countries before coming back to Canada. Yeah. But it's kind of, I think you're right there. I'm curious like what you see
Like, do you see her as someone that you'd be interested in learning more about? Like,
Yep.
or like, where do you see her in the grand scheme of like Canadian music and stuff like that? Like, what's your final?
It doesn't seems like she was a very strong innovator. She was just very good at what she did.
Right.
Which I think is why we don't like talk about her so much anymore, because she didn't change the landscape necessarily.
She was there during changes, but she didn't initiate.
Yeah, exactly.
those
She
changes.
never propagated change herself.
Right, right.
But I still think like she's a great role model to talk about.
Interesting. How so?
She just the fact that, you know, because we were talking about, oh yeah, she left Canada, but if she still viewed herself as Canadian, I still think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's just what you'd like. Sometimes in Canada, if you can't find success here, don't be afraid to leave.
Yeah.
My family did it.
That's true.
My dad left, like many other families, other Canadians, I'm sure we left. We kept Canada in our hearts, but we left because that was where success would be. That was where opportunity was.
Yeah.
And I think she's an inspiration in that way. She's an inspiration to girls everywhere. Don't let yourself be conformed. Don't let anybody hold your talent back.
Yeah. Absolutely. I do think it is kind of interesting to see her, to view her life in the same kind of way that we kind of set up at first, of being a parallel to how music itself actually changed in Canada from this like very simple thing to appreciating or bringing in foreign talent and then exporting our own versions of it. Like, you can kind of see this as a case study or a microcosmic, I guess, case study of the changes that were going on in the Canadian music sphere at that time, right? Which I think is kind of cool, right, when you think about it. And I also, in the clip that we were playing, I do think it's important to note, did you notice like the types of instruments that were used? It was just a piano, right? It was a very simple setup, and obviously recording at the time limited how many musical instruments you could actually put into a recording. But it is kind of interesting that you still do see this kind of back to basics element, despite her being trained in this very elaborate style that is opera, right? And yeah, I guess that's kind of where I would leave that off. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about her? Any questions? It was more of me presenting her life to her in the like second half.
Just because somebody doesn't live in Canada doesn't mean they're not fucking Canadian. Just because somebody doesn't come from Canada originally and moves to Canada doesn't mean they're not fucking Canadian.
Preach.
I'm sorry, I don't know, it's a very basic thing to say, but I still, for some reason, feel like it needs to be said somehow.
No, I can agree, but that gets
obviously... As somebody who, like, moved around a lot, my home was always Canada.
Yeah. That obviously comes back to, like, this whole issue of who are we and where is here type of thing.
And Emma Albani is a great showcase of that in her life.
Yeah.
Especially with how she left, how she like changed her name and sort of erased her French Canadian identity, I say in quotation marks.
Yeah.
Because that's not how it goes. That's not how it worked.
Exactly.
She was only adapting to the circumstances around her. If anything, that makes her even more Canadian. She was trying to be polite and blend in with the culture around her. How fucking Canadian is that? Oh, sorry about my name. I'll change it. No need to worry. Sorry there, bud. My name's Albany now.
She's multicultural insofar as she knew many languages and adapted many styles. There you go.
There you go. Knowing many languages. Again, Canadian. We're a bilingual country, folks.
Sure. Right. No, but I do think we're making a bit of a joke about it, but I do think you bring up some like really interesting points about that.
Well, yeah, it's more just he's a great textbook example for how Canada fucks over its talent.
Yeah. Absolutely.
As in, like, this idea, like, this mentality that seems to exist, like, you have to do or die saying you're Canadian, living in Canada, being Canadian. And that happened, we see that happen all over the place, you know?
Yeah.
But the same with First Nation reserve rules.
Yeah.
You have to live on the reservation to get the benefits. You have to stay here. This has to be your only identity. It's like, you're just choking me, dude, right now, and not the good kind of choking. Like, back off a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole point. Yeah.
And you see, it's just how Canada's choking itself. You know, it's choking its own talent. It's choking its own potential.
Yep. So, what's left to say then? Where can people reach out?
Where can they reach out? You can leave a review on iTunes. Tell people what you're seeing. This show spreads most of all by word of mouth because we don't know how to do marketing. We're English and history nerds. We're not smart business people. If we were smart business people, we wouldn't be doing a Canadian history podcast. You can Also, send us an email.
Yeah.
Check out our affiliate links. Check out our Patreon. We have 5 members now. Do you want us to read out their names, Patrick?
Yes, absolutely. I forgot to mention it at the beginning of the show, but thank
What
you
a
very
horrible
much.
fucking host.
I know. Thank you very much to Craig, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, and James. All of you are super, super appreciated. And yeah, listeners, help us reach our goal of 10 patrons.
Woo!
Yeah, let's do
Pay
this.
for our nice dinner that we like to have.
No, you have to tell them that we
Donate it.
Yeah, we donate it to.
We donate it to my belly.
No, but honestly, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And we'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Bye. Wow. That's such a weak way of saying bye.
Bye.
There
Cheers. Cheers, bitches.